Field of law enforcement, where she has worked as a dispatcher, 911 operator, a probation officer, patrol officer, a detective investigating both criminal property and crimes against persons. In 2013, Allie became a criminal investigator with the state of Colorado and worked for several years in the Department of Labor and Employment before moving to the Colorado Attorney General office. Allie has presented local trainings in numerous topics, including fraud, elder abuse, domestic violence, child abuse, and interviewing techniques, as she has become a national law enforcement training for both domestic violence investigations and the investigation of elder abuse. Allie has a passion for fighting for justice for those who may not be able to fight for themselves and strives to be voice for the voiceless and vulnerable. Please welcome Allie.
Thank you. Okay, so is my mic on? Can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. So that was a really long bio that I wrote, wasn't it? I'm sorry you guys had to sit through that thing. Yeah, go ahead. So now you know a little bit about me. The bulk of my career was actually spent at Boulder County Sheriff's Office, where I worked patrol and an FTO and a detective. And I was there for a little over 10 years. And while I was there, I was the elder chick. I was the one responsible for investigating elder abuse and being the liaison for the DA's office and providing training. Once I came over to the Attorney General's office, I realized how much I didn't know back then, especially surrounding facilities and more of the laws concerning at risk. So I look back then and realize what I missed, just not knowing what to look for. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, who we are, what we do, some of the laws, and then we're going to get into the signs and symptoms of abuse, and then get into a couple case studies that we've been working in our unit. Okay, so my boss, Bob Booth, usually comes and does this with me, and his part is this first part. So we're gonna kind of muddle through. I'm gonna read my notes pretty closely on this part because it's Bob's, but then I'll get into my stuff and we'll kind of get in the groove. So bear with me on this kind of boring stuff that Bob usually does. So Medicaid is ridiculously big in the United States. The US spends over $600 billion annually on Medicaid, and those numbers are as of 2017. But Medicaid started back in the 60s when President Lyndon Johnson signed Medicaid into law as part of the Social Security Act to try to ensure that all low-income individuals and people with disabilities had access to basic health care. Medicaid is a joint federal and state program that provides the health coverage and nursing home coverage to certain categories of low-asset people. The program has grown exponentially over the years, most notably the Affordable Care Act. And together, CHIP and Medicaid cover over 39% of children in the US. So here in Colorado, the state of Colorado spends over $7.9 billion per year on Medicaid, just in the state. Now that is combining the federal and state money. As with any government program, though, after it was created, they realized, oh, shoot, people are stealing money from us. And they had kind of a knee-jerk reaction, which the government never does, and they created the Medicaid Fraud Control Units. So in 1987, we started back in the 70s. The Medicaid Fraud Control Units were founded. And then in 1987, Governor Roy Romer signed an executive order putting our Medicaid Fraud Control Unit under the purview of the AG's office, and that's where we are now. Starting this year, we have a new law in the books, and that law was signed last year. You can see me, and then Governor Hickenlooper, yay, my moment of fame there. But the new law was signed into effect, reaffirming our original jurisdiction over Medicaid provider fraud, as well as patient abuse, neglect, and exploitation. This law also prohibits kickbacks and makes it a misdemeanor to have kickbacks, kind of like the doctors promote or getting paid for prescribing drugs, that kind of stuff. And then it also makes a separate and distinct law of Medicaid provider fraud. Okay, so the mission statement of our unit, we're dedicated to the investigation and prosecution of Medicaid provider fraud and the investigation and prosecution of abuse and neglect of patients. So I want to just really make it clear that we just do provider fraud. We do not do recipient fraud. So our unit is fun because we're a multidisciplinary unit. We actually have a forensic auditor on staff who's amazing. She goes, for the fraud guys, she goes through all the records and is able to find stuff that, like a needle in the haystack. We also have a nurse analyst on staff, and she's my rock. I can give her thousands of pages of medical records, and she'll go through and say, here's what's important, and give me a 3-page report. It's amazing. And then we also have our paralegal, and our attorneys are right across the hall, which makes it nice most of the time, because if we have a legal question, we can go across and ask a question. The only time it's not nice is when they try to steer our investigations a little bit. But then we have the investigative supervisor, Bruce, and then we have me, who's the abuse and neglect investigator, and we have several fraud investigators. Right now, we're in the hiring process for an additional abuse and neglect investigator, and that cannot happen soon enough. Okay, so the MFCUs, by federal statute, have the authority to do both civil crimes as well as criminal crimes. And we're authorized to take action under the Colorado False Claims Act. That means primarily when our civil jurisdiction comes in is if we will join into kind of global cases for like big pharmacy, trying to get money back from them when they've defrauded Medicaid, or if we have a case where we know it's not right, they're not providing the care that they've said that they would provide to, say, residents of a nursing home. We can go back and say, you know what, this is a contract issue. We paid you to provide this care and you failed to. That's a nice little way we can get kind of in the back door of facilities when we know that something's wrong, but we can't quite find out either who's responsible for the lack of care, or we can't quite get to that beyond a reasonable doubt burden. Okay, so our criminal jurisdiction is for fraud as well as abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Promise we're almost through the boring stuff. Okay, so fraud. We seek to identify overpayments that have been done fraudulently. If somebody just doesn't know how to bill and they make a few mistakes, we're not going to go after them. But if we have, one of our cases was a speech pathologist who had names of kids and just started charging Medicaid for seeing them. And when we went back, there were 60-some kids that she had never seen. And we got $1.2 million out of that case. We also see cases of billing for old items that are shown, I can't say that word today, sorry, that are shown to be new or told to be new. For instance, we had a wheelchair case where they were refurbing wheelchairs and then charging the Medicaid for new wheelchairs. And you guys can kind of read the rest of the details on that. So we get a lot of our cases through HCPF, especially our fraud cases. We'll also get fraud cases through CDPHE, complaints from individual citizens or disgruntled former employees. Those are fun because then we have a really good witness to start off our case with. And then we'll also get some federal cases handed down to us. So things that we look for, kind of the warning signs of fraud, duplicate billings, people who aren't receiving the care or over-medicating or under-medicating, because that's more of a not providing the care that they're being paid for, and then evidence of inadequate care when bills are paid, stuff like that. Okay, now we're through the boring stuff. Well, this is usually Bob's too because he's an attorney. I'm a cop, so I'm kind of like whatever, legal disclaimer. So all defendants in these cases are presumed innocent unless they've been proven guilty. We're going to talk one case where we did not file charges, and the other case where it's been adjudicated and she's been convicted, so I can say her name all I want. Okay, so this is the good stuff. I can stop reading my notes for the most part. Okay, so my job as the abuse, neglect, and exploitation investigator is to review complaints of resident abuse, obviously. We look at physical abuse, neglect, as well as the exploitation. So I investigate crimes. I have been doing a lot of consulting lately. Last week, I took 10 calls from different agencies asking me for help. So that's become a really large part of my job. Sometimes we open and assist, in which case we can help get medical records because we're a health oversight agency or organization, so we're HIPAA exempt, which is a fun fact. And then I go around and provide training. I did a training back in New Orleans last month, and I do a lot of law enforcement training, but also trainings for citizens as well. My favorite right now is I'm doing a training on interviewing people with disabilities and talking to people who are nonverbal because unless you're in a coma, you can communicate, and it's our job to figure out how people communicate and do our best interviewing them. This is a super small flow chart. Basically, what this flow chart says is that we have abuse and neglect jurisdiction over any facility that has 2 or more unrelated people who are getting funding and the facility is getting funding for assistance with ADLs or nursing care. That make sense? Okay. We're gonna kind of zoom through this stuff because I want to get to the good stuff. So we get our cases from everywhere. CDPHE will throw us cases. I just had a case from APS down in, where was I, Lamar. That's a fun part of the state. Ombudsmen have called us with cases. We get cases from citizens, residents of facilities. So we get them from every angle. And I just investigate a case normally. I don't know why this is even in there. It gets assigned to me. I do my investigation, and then we do case reviews every other month where our whole team gets together and we review cases. And that's really actually helpful because we get several pairs of eyes on the case, including attorneys. So if there's anything that we might be missing or anything that they need in order to ensure a successful prosecution, we get that right away. And then it gets assigned to the attorney. I write a warrant, we arrest people, and then it gets assigned to the attorney. Then we go through the court system, they get convicted, and after conviction of anything that comes out of our unit, they're automatically excluded from the Medicaid program. So if I arrest a doctor, they can never receive Medicaid funding again, which is fun. So an at-risk person. Hopefully you guys, most everybody in the room knows this. So an at-risk person means an at-risk adult, which is someone who's 18 years of age or older, and a person with a disability. There's an at-risk adult with IDD, which is 18 or older with an IDD. At-risk elder, which is 70 years or older. We do not have to show a disability in that case. And then at-risk juveniles, who's anyone under 18 who has a disability. So the definition of disability in the state of Colorado is super broad. You guys can kind of read through this. It's loss of any limb, can't walk, talk, speak, or speak and talk are the same thing. Walk, see, hear, or speak. Need assistance with breathing. Non-ambulatory, mentally impaired, developmentally disabled. The one that is super broad is that mental health disorder. If you go to the 27 code, it's so broad. So I encourage officers that if they have someone that they think might fit, go ahead and open your CRS or go to the Secretary of State and look at what that definition is. Okay, so the fun thing about figuring out if someone's at risk or not is that if they are, we can charge under 18.6.5103, which is our wrongs to at-risk adults. This allows us to enhance the penalties. So basically, it's the same overall charge of third-degree assault. But if you have third-degree assault against a typical person, it's a class 1 misdemeanor. If it happens against an at-risk adult and you charge under this statute, it ups it to a class 6 felony. So that gives us a lot more teeth. Same with theft, it ups it 1 charge. So if you have a class 1 misdemeanor, it's a class 6 felony. If it's a class 4 felony, it ups it to a class 3 felony. So criminally negligent homicide is typically an F5. Well, when it's against an at-risk, it's an F4. And then, I'm not sure if I have, criminal exploitation. Sometimes I have a slide in there for criminal exploitation. I love the criminal exploitation charge because it basically says that with undue influence or her intimidation or deception, if someone temporarily or permanently deprives someone of something of value, we can still charge it. And the levels are super low compared to the theft charge. So the temporarily is nice. I had a case out of Boulder County when I worked in Boulder County where an administrator of a nursing home was POA and rep payee for 2 clients. And they were kind of borrowing from Peter, paying Paul, and just kind of shuffling money around. And it kept decreasing every month, of course, and they're paying bills and trying to stay afloat. And when the jig was up and we started to get bank records, suddenly, magically, all the money reappeared. Well, under the theft statute, we were going to have an issue because there's not a permanent deprivation of that money. But under the criminal exploitation, we were able to charge with a pretty high felony. So some red flags that I encourage people to look for when they're talking to someone, they have that feeling that something might be going on, If the caregiver won't let you talk to the person alone, that should be a huge red flag. If they're answering for the person, huge red flag. Of course, this is fluid if someone has dementia or severe cognitive abilities or cognitive disabilities. Is there a change in the victim's behavior? Are they becoming withdrawn, or are they suddenly having issues with hygiene care that they haven't in the past? And we'll get into that in a little bit when we talk about sex assault. Oh, I do talk about financial exploitation. Sorry, I haven't done this presentation in quite a while. So some things to look at. A POA doesn't give you a license to steal. Anything done under the POA has to be for the benefit of the elder. So we had a guy who was spending all of Mom's money. He had a POA. He bought a ski boat. Well, Mom was in a wheelchair. She never went on the ski boat. So we saw that pattern, and so we were able to charge him with financial exploitation for stealing Mom's money. And his excuse was, well, it's going to be mine when she dies anyway. Okay, well, she's not dead yet, and she may need long-term care. She may need this money going forward. Addition of names to wills or checking accounts, always a pretty big red flag for us. And then the banks are getting really good about giving us calls when suddenly $3,000 starts going to an unnamed person or an unknown person every month. So we catch a lot through that. Okay, so indicators of physical abuse. So unexplained signs of injuries. Old people bruise, right? So my mom is 73 now, and a few years ago I saw a bruise on her arm, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's an old person bruise. Because they spread out, they get that really purple thing, and I'm like, what did you do? And it looked horrible, and she said, I hit my arm against the wall when I was walking by. Okay, but they look awful. So if they don't have a good explanation for them, we need to start looking a little deeper. Obviously, broken bones are always kind of a red flag or an indicator. What we're seeing coming out of a lot of facilities right now are cases where people will fall and will break something, and they're like, well, it was accidental. Was it? What we do is we look a little deeper. Did they have a fall protocol? Were they supposed to be using a wheelchair or a walker, and the walker was placed across the room and they couldn't get to it, and so they fell? So we look a little bit deeper into care plans and really kind of dig, especially if we're having significant issues with certain facilities. So broken eyeglasses. I've had these glasses. It's a really old prescription, so you might see me squinting because they're not as effective anymore. But I'm probably one of the clumsiest people on the face of the earth. And I've had these glasses for 5 years, and they're scratched up. I drop these at least once a day. They've never broken. It's actually pretty hard to break eyeglasses unless you step on them or sit on them. So if somebody's eyeglasses are broken and they don't have a good explanation for how it happened, and they have bruising on the side of their face or something, that's pretty good evidence. And then signs of being restrained are always good. And again, I'm hammering on the refusal of caregiver to let you see their client alone. So back to the bruising. 90% of our bruising is on the extremities, because we run into stuff, right? We knock our knees into desks. They're not on necks, ears, the genital area. It's really rare to have one on your butt or the soles of your feet. If bruises are on your trunk, you're much more likely to remember how you got them. So I already mentioned that I'm the clumsiest person on the face of the earth. 2 winters, not last winter, but the winter before, I was walking to work and there was a huge ice storm, and I bit it hard. I was standing on the corner. I didn't even take a step. It was just like I was up and down, and I landed on my gun. And I had a huge gun-shaped bruise on my hip that was there for like 2 weeks. I remember that bruise because it was significant and it was on my trunk. If somebody has a significant bruise on their trunk, they're going to remember how they got it, unless they have major cognitive disabilities or impairment. And then on the extremities, they might not remember. I have a bruise on my arm right now. I have no idea how I got it. But it never hurts to ask the victim, hey, I see you have a bruise on your arm. How did you get this? So those are some examples of some bruises. Okay, so sexual abuse. I mentioned that I was in Lamar for the last few days. I was actually investigating a sex assault in a facility down there. Disabled people and elders are victimized at a rate 3 times higher than typical people. Because, does anybody know why? Can you think of any reasons why? I'm going to engage you guys a little bit. Come on, why are elderly folks and disabled people victimized at a higher rate? It's easier, I heard. I'm sorry? Because they can't defend themselves. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, sir. Caregiver stress. I don't know of, hold on, I don't know of any case where someone's sexually assaulted. Okay, no, okay. Ma'am, that's okay. They're less likely to report. That is absolutely a reason. Anybody think of what I think of as kind of the number one reason? They're poor witnesses. How about the dependence they have on people for hygiene? They are a lot of them are completely dependent on people to help them go to the bathroom, to help them bathe. My victim this week was a woman who was non-ambulatory. She has cerebral palsy. She's in her late 60s, and she needs help for all of her ADLs. So when she goes in the shower, she's put into a lift. So she's lifted up. She has absolutely no way to get herself out of that situation. She is literally hanging there ripe for assault. So this happens. What we see, I talk about criminal and non-criminal on this slide. What we see a lot with the elder population, and see I get to wander around now because this is the stuff I know. With the elder population and the IDD population is grooming. Very often like what we see in child abuse. They start talking about sex. They start kind of sensitizing them to sex. I've had a case where they were showing porn to the victim. In this case this week, he started talking to her about sex. Have you ever had sex? Do you know what a penis looks like? Stuff like that. And that stuff, even though it's not criminal to ask somebody if they know what a penis looks like, it's good to document for officers or to tell officers when they're responding because it's good evidence in the report of that grooming. And we can get an expert in there to say, well, yeah, they typically groom. So signs of sexual assault, especially in elders. The emergence of new STDs should always be a red flag. It's kind of a big red truck, or what we call a clue. I mentioned earlier kind of a sudden behavior change. This woman, after she was sexually assaulted, she no longer wanted to be showered. She was fighting her showers. Well, no kidding. I wouldn't want to be showered either if I had been assaulted repeatedly in the shower. She started having issues with this one caregiver. And everyone was like, well, she doesn't like him. That's why she's making this. Well, no kidding, she doesn't like him because he's been assaulting her. I had a case out of when I was in Boulder County of a woman who had pretty advanced dementia. And she started talking about her new boyfriend. And everybody kind of hopefully knows, like when you have Alzheimer's, you kind of live your life backwards. You're in different periods of your life. And her kids were like, oh, how cute, mom's remembering when she was meeting dad. Because she's talking about, yeah, my boyfriend came over last night, and on about this new boyfriend. She was bedbound. And she presented with a broken pelvis. That's when they were like, oh crap, maybe something's going on. So we put a nanny cam in, and we were able to find out that it was the maintenance man that was her new boyfriend. So I encourage people, take anything that elders or IDD people say seriously when it comes to sex assault. This week, this woman was discounted. They did not believe her. They thought that she was accusing this guy of sex assault because she had a personal vendetta against him. Local sheriff's office went out, took a report, interviewed the suspect. He said, I didn't do that. Why would I do that? I'm married. I wouldn't do that. And they walked away from it. And I said, nope, we're going to open an investigation. We're going to come down to Lamar. And I went down there, spent the last 3 days down there. And yesterday, our suspect completely confessed. He did it all. And when I went back to the sheriff's office and sat down with the deputy and said, hey, I just substantiated the charges. I'm going to be writing a warrant. You're going to need to go arrest him for me. He was dumbfounded because he believed him. But you need to get an experienced person in there and take all allegations seriously. So these are just the key points. I already kind of went through all of this. Yes. Okay.
Alec, have you ever had male sexual abuse?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have a case right now where it's actually a really good case. This gentleman, he's not an elder, but he's disabled. He has cerebral palsy. He's 47 years old. He's in a wheelchair, very contractured, nonverbal, but he has intonations for yes, no, yes and no. And I went out and I interviewed him and we came up with an intonation for something else and for I don't know. And we luckily have a witness, otherwise it would be a lot harder of a case, but he confirmed everything the witness had said, and he was sexually assaulted by one of his caregivers. She liked to tell him, I'm gonna take you to a hotel and we're gonna have sex and I'm gonna have your baby, just to be mean. And then she eventually sexually assaulted him. And I don't know if it was for her sexual pleasure or just to screw with this guy. But regardless, he can't defend himself. He can't get out of there. So yes, we do see it much more often in females, but it does happen with males as well. Yes. I can repeat your question too. How are you? I know these two.
Hi, Allie.
Hi.
Detective Chuck Sharkowski, Colorado Springs Police. We get a lot of complaints of sexual assaults when care providers, especially males, are providing peri-care for females. How do you sort those out?
Well, funny you should ask that because this week's involved that somewhat. Hopefully no one's easily offended because when we start talking about sex assaults, we have to talk about some things that make people squirm a little bit. So while the allegation that she said was he digitally penetrated her vagina, he rubbed his penis on her, and he fondled himself. The key to this case was that she was able to describe something yellow that came out of his penis. And I asked her, well, was it pee? Like, was it liquidy like urine? And she said, no, it was more like lotion. There was no reason why this woman should have been able to explain what semen looked like. None. And I used that in my investigation. So what I got him to admit to was, because I pulled the DNA card, right? I said, okay, as this goes forward, you know, this is your one chance to tell me the truth, and I'm using all my best interrogation skills. And I said, if we find DNA, you're going to be in trouble if you don't come clean now. This is your one opportunity to tell me the truth, because if we find DNA, we're going to be able to show that you lied. And that's what got him to admit, yes, I masturbated in front of him. He still denied the digital penetration and made it into a peri-care issue. Said, well, when I was wiping her, my fingers went into her. And to combat that, you need to ask very detailed questions. I combated that by saying, how far did your fingers go in? And he indicated his knuckle. I'm sorry, there is absolutely no peri-care that requires that. If there's an issue that far up, you need to be going to a doctor, not an unskilled worker or even a CNA. The other indicator that told me he was lying was I said, how many occasions did this happen? And he said 2, kind of like the 2 beers thing, twice, only happened twice. Well, if this is truly peri-care and this is how you do this, you're not going to know that it only happened twice. And he's full of it because it happened more than twice. But you have to really kind of pick apart that. Peri-care is hard. You need to get the SANE exams if there's any indications of injury, and really dissect what they're saying compared to what your victim says. Does that help at all?
Yeah, we use polygraphs.
Polygraphs help too. I didn't need one with him because I got him to admit, but yeah, polygraphs are always fun too. Other questions yet? Okay, thanks, Chuck.
I got one more, but a
Yeah.
couple slides back, you talked about investigating facilities for underpay and understaffed. How do you determine that? Because in my estimate, they're all underpaid and they're all understaffed.
They are. And the fun thing in Colorado, we don't have a regulation giving a staffing level. It just says you will have adequate staff, which makes our job really, really hard because I can't say, well, the ratio is supposed to be 6-to-1. If I could say the ratio is supposed to be 6-to-1, then it's just basic math. You had 3 people on and you have 40 people there, you didn't get your ratio. But instead, we have to be able to show, and I'm going to get into protective oversight and some of the stuff we look at. So hopefully I'll answer your question a little bit better. I don't want to get too far ahead. If I don't, call me on it and ask again, okay? Thanks. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
So I just wanted to go back to something you said. I'm a case manager, and I had a client say that she was sexually assaulted by her caregiver.
Okay.
And I did the standard reporting. I let the sheriff's office know because she was above 69 years of age.
Okay.
They went out, did a report, and said everything was fine. As a case manager, when that happens, but you believe something else is going on, what do you suggest we do as our obligation to report it?
Okay, so legally, you've fulfilled your obligation to report. Ethically, you've probably fulfilled your obligation to report as well. However, on a moral ground, I understand where you would have an issue. It's really hard once law enforcement comes in and makes what I think or you think or someone thinks is a bad assessment. Your next step, honestly, would be calling the DA's office and saying, hey, do you have an investigator who could look over this and see if there's anything that was missed? If it's a facility, you can call our office. My thing is it's never bad to get more sets of eyes on an investigation because I miss stuff in every investigation, I'm sure, just because you can't possibly see it all. And getting an expert to look at it or getting the DA's office to take a second look at it, but the sheriff's offices and the police departments have the ability to close a case if they don't feel they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the other thing. You have to get to a pretty high standard to criminally charge someone. And I think I get a little further into that. We have to be able to prove mental state, that they knowingly, recklessly, or negligent. There's 4 that we have to be able to prove. And then we have to be able to prove all of the elements of the crime. And sometimes we just can't get there. At a minimum, she should be given mental health services and access to a sex assault advocacy center to help her through it. Does that help? Okay. Okay, let's move on. So enhanced penalties, again, this is under that 18.6.5103. These are penalties that are enhanced when they're at risk. So unlawful sexual contact is usually a misdemeanor. When it's done against an at-risk, it's an F6. And then you can read, first and second degree sex assault are also upped. So it's fun. I just skipped over that. The legislature, I don't want to say screwed up, but the way the sex assault statute is written under the 18.6.5103 is really hard because it actually goes back into the early 2000s to when we had first and second degree sex assault. And I actually had to have somebody take me over to the Supreme Court Law Library to find, because I was in the academy when we had first and second degree sex assault. It was changed not that far after that. So you have to find what the elements of first degree and second degree sex assault were back in freaking 2000. I think it changed in 2006. And then charge according to that. So hopefully someone will catch that and make a little change because it's a real pain in the butt for cops to figure out what level you're charging on these. So, okay, that's my little soapbox. Okay, so hopefully y'all know this. Mandatory reporting kicked in 2016. I was part of the Boulder County Elder Justice Coalition way back when, and we were pushing for mandatory reporting back then, and there was a large pushback from the disabled community. Can anybody tell me why? Why would the disabled community not want mandatory reporting? Yes, ma'am. You said because it's typically their caregiver or family. No. There you go. He said you can take away their individual rights. Think back on the definition of disability. If we put at-risk adult in this, it covers people who are blind, people who are deaf. Just because I can't see, if I'm raped and don't want to report it, I shouldn't have to. And that was the argument. So this went through years and years and years of lobbyists and talks and meetings. And finally, they settled on at-risk elder, so 70 or over, and at-risk adult with IDD. So it covers those who have an intellectual disability. They are mandatory, you have to mandatory report on those, but you do not have to do mandatory reporting on someone with a disability outside of IDD. Okay, so these slides kind of got messed up. All of that's supposed to be in the dark green, and I'm not sure why it's a little out, but I apologize, it's hard to read. So most of my cases right now are falling into this criminal negligence mess. So neglect of an at-risk adult, basically any person whose conduct amounts to criminal negligence, as defined, blah, 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 we're going to talk more about that. It's a class 4 felony if it's death, so criminally negligent homicide against an at-risk is a class 4 felony. Class 5 if it's SBI. SBI is broken bones, loss of limbs, permanent disfigurement, second and third degree burns is considered SBI. It's serious risk of death, pretty much. And then class 6 if it's bodily injury. And bodily injury is defined as something as little as pain. If somebody says it hurt, we have bodily injury. If you have redness from a slap, it's bodily injury. So, but you need to document it. So even if somebody slaps somebody and they're an at-risk adult, it's a felony. Cops like felonies more than misdemeanors, in case you haven't picked up on this. So, criminal negligence. A person acts with criminal negligence when, through a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise, he or she fails to perceive a substantial and unjustifiable risk that a result will occur or a circumstance exists. What's wrong with this statute? And everything's not a good reason. Sorry, what?
What's a gross deviation?
What is a gross deviation? What else is wrong with the statute? Reasonable. Who is a reasonable person? Go ahead.
No, I
Oh, sometimes. I don't know. I've met you a few times. I'm not sure. What else? Substantial, unjustifiable. It's subjective. This entire statute is subjective. And DAs do not like subjective. They like, we're going to win this. They don't like, well, what's a gross deviation? What's a standard of care? Is it a standard of care that a normal or reasonable person would take, or is it a standard of care a reasonable person who has that training would take? So, yes, sir. Amend the statute. Yes, I would love to amend a lot of statutes. Unfortunately, that literally takes an act of Congress, state Congress. Yeah, we recognize that there's issues with our criminal negligence statute. So what I'm training people to do is kind of get as far past it and make it as least subjective as possible. So the first thing I usually tell my cops when I'm training them is, if you tell your mom about a case and she goes, oh my God, that's horrible, how could that happen? You probably have a gross deviation from a reasonable person's standard, unless your mom isn't reasonable, like Chuck. But again, prosecutors don't really like it when I say that. They want something a little more concrete. So what I've been doing to kind of go to standard of care is looking at CCRs. And everybody has access to this. I think that's the next slide. Secretary of State website has the CCRs. So you can go to 6 CCR 1011 and pull up standards for every health facility in the state that CDPHE regulates. Now these are regulatory, not criminal, but it's a place to start. And this is what I even got the new picture up there. Aren't you impressed? I did this last week, so it would be updated. So this is what the site looks like when you pull it up, and you can see the ones that I usually go to. our nursing care, assisted living, and DD facilities, where most of my cases are. But you pull them up and there's bookmarks. When you hyperlink, there's bookmarks. And they changed the site around a little bit because there used to be more hyperlinks, but back in June, they renumbered everything. Fun times. And they took the hyperlinks away. So you have to search a little harder for it now. But under, it says like the minimum services, these are the minimum services for assisted living facilities. Physically safe and sanitary environment. Room and board. Personal care services, protective oversight, and then social care and engagement. These are the minimum services. So if we can prove that they're not providing protective oversight, that's a standard of care that they're held to regulatory, right? So we can start to create more concrete understanding of that statute. We're going to get back into that. So caretaker neglect, if there is no injury, it's a misdemeanor. And the reason I like this, the wording of caretaker neglect, is it says, in a manner likely to be injurious to the physical or mental welfare of the person. That mirrors the child abuse statute. And I like it because if you have someone who's just demeaning and evil and horrible to someone, you can look at caretaker neglect, even if there's not bed sores or anything like that. Okay, so signs of neglect, these are kind of a big red truck. Weight loss, being left dirty, unsanitary living conditions, not taking them to the doctor, not getting them medication, not giving them medication, and desertion of the elder at a public place. 9 News did an expose on that. I was in New Orleans like 2 months ago. They did a story on residential facilities who were discharging people and just leaving them places like hospitals or other facilities. And I think there's a special place in hell for people who do that. Okay, pressure sores. So pressure sores are staged. Stage 1 is pretty much redness. Stage 2, these pictures get a little gross. And then unstageable. The unstageable ones, you actually have to debride, which means you have to cut away the dead skin to stage it, which is awful. Pressure sores in and of themselves are not neglect. They're not. Pressure sores happen. However, if you have an allegation of neglect and you have pressure sores, they can be, or if you have other evidence along with the allegation, I should say, sorry. If you have the dirty living conditions, if you have medications that haven't been administered or lack of medical care, and you have these awful pressure sores, they can be really good evidence. I have some anatomical models of pressure sores in my office, which is so fun because I have them displayed on a shelf and they're like butts because they're sacral, and then I have a foot that's all like eaten away. And inevitably once a week somebody's walking down the hall and they'll stop and be like, what the heck? Because I have these pressure sores up on my shelf. I'm a little twisted in case you guys haven't picked up on that yet. But pressure sores can be really good evidence, but you cannot base a case solely on pressure sores. We cannot find a doctor to say, yes, this stage 4 pressure sore was as a result of neglect. So if I do have a case with pressure sores, the first thing I look at are the records. Were they receiving wound care? If they were, we don't have neglect. If they called wound care, the wound care person was coming and giving treatment, but it got worse because of their other comorbidities, we don't have a case. Okay, let's get back to protective oversight. So the way, again, we're going back to the CCRs. The way they define protective oversight is being aware of the resident's general whereabouts. If you have someone who's wandered from a secure facility and they don't realize they're gone for 8 hours, that's a problem. And then monitoring the activities while on premises to ensure their health, safety, and well-being, ensuring that they receive the care necessary. So on these cases where I have, when you get a case, it's pretty clear straight up that this is probably a protective oversight issue. I'm going to talk about one of those today, but I had a case, for instance, where a woman was admitted into a non-secure assisted living facility. And she had pretty advanced dementia. They never should have had admitted her into that facility. They could not provide the care she needed. And that's kind of where we went after them for, the admission person, but they wanted the money, and she was a private pay. So they were getting $5,000 a month to care for this woman, and they weren't caring for her, and she wandered one night and got hit and killed by a car. So that's kind of, that came across my desk, and I'm like, this is a protective oversight and admission issue. Well, at first I thought it was protective oversight. Then once I dug a little deeper and saw the progression of her dementia, I realized this is an admission and retention issue because she had been there for about 4 months and they had done additional evals on her. Okay, so whenever I realize it's going to be protective oversight, my first question to the administrator is, what does your facility do to meet the protective oversight regulation? They will know. It will either be something like, well, we have certain people assigned to certain areas of the facility. You know, this CNA is assigned to the dining room, this person's assigned to outside, or they'll be assigned certain residents or certain rooms to watch over. Or in the case of this case I'm going to talk about, they had a 15-minute head count. So every 15 minutes they were going to go around and make sure that everybody was safe and everybody was healthy and accounted for, because it was a memory care. So I'm kind of flying through this. Any questions yet? Okay. So in this case example, we had an 80-year-old woman who had advanced dementia. She was in memory care facility, and again, you just saw that head count sheet. They had that 15-minute head count to do the protective oversight. So according to the staff member, she was last seen at 5:45 in the morning. She said, I did my 5:45 head count, and she was in bed. At 6 o'clock, it was time for breakfast. And I'm sorry, she did her 5:30 head count. At 5:45, it was time for breakfast. She went back and couldn't find her. And so she started looking around, and she found her outside, laying on the ground in the backyard. She told her, get up, get up, get up, and she wouldn't get up. So she brought a blanket out, rolled the resident onto the blanket, and luckily there was a ramp there. She drug her up the ramp and into the house, and then called 911. The historical weather data showed that it was 28 degrees that morning at that time. 911 call came in at 6:17. Ambulance came. She hadn't died yet. She was still alive. They took her to the emergency room. They did a core body temp, and her core body temp was 84 degrees. So I get this case, and I start collecting evidence. And the evidence I look for are the client files, policy and procedure manuals, employee files. I want to see what training they've had. I want to see if there's been any other incidents with this employee. I want to see their schedules. I want to know how many times have they worked with this resident, because protective oversight is what the resident needs. It shouldn't be a facility-wide policy. It's what that particular resident needs. All surveillance footage. I have another case where a woman died outside, and she died on camera. And local police went out and got the footage. That's great. But then I got on the case about a month later and said, where's the rest of the footage? And they said, well, we just got that one camera angle. And I'm like, well, that sucks, because there's 7 other cameras, and had they gotten all of it, I would have been able to see what the caregivers were doing while she was dying outside. Were they texting? Were they laughing? That's going to play great side by side to a jury. So all surveillance footage, and surveillance footage is fleeting. You maybe have 10 to 15 days to get it at most places. Every facility is required to do an internal investigation. And I always like that, because usually the written statements in the part of that is their statements, they're fresh, and they don't really realize they're in trouble yet most of the time, so it's the closest thing you get to the truth. And then previous internal accident or incident reports, because I want to look at the facility. Is this a facility problem, or is it the caregiver who's not doing their checks? And then CDPHE investigation. They really helped one of my cases. I'm trying not to swear, because I was told not to swear. So if I pause halfway through a sentence, that's because I'm trying to be good. But CDPHE does an excellent job. They're looking at different things than us. They're looking at regulatory, but they find evidence that we don't sometimes. Okay, so in the client file, I'm looking at admission agreements. I'm looking at their assessments. How were they when they came there? Sorry to say, elders don't get better. Dementia doesn't get better. So if I have a baseline for when they moved in, then I can see, okay, well, they've been here 5 years. They probably declined from this. I want their care plan. That's going to tell me what they require for that protective oversight and those minimal services. Cues and clues are like, and we'll talk about those in the next case, they're primarily used in the IDD world. They're named different things, but they're kind of a cliff note of a behavioral plan. And then I want to see nurses' notes. Okay, so on her admission agreement, I need my notes again, because I don't want to miss anything for you guys. So on her admission agreement, I know it's super tiny on your things, but this is just an idea of what it looks like. This is basically the civil contract between their next of kin or whoever their guardian is, or them, and the facility. This is basically what they're going to provide. Again, has not much to do with a criminal case. However, it helps us establish that standard of care. Because if they say, we're going to make sure you're safe, we monitor you 24 hours a day, it shows, okay, this is the standard that the facility is saying they're going to meet, and it helps us get past some of that subjectiveness. So in this admission agreement, it says 24-hour staffing. All staff are oriented to the residents that they serve. Okay. The resident's rights statement, free to be free from neglect. Again, can we use that in a criminal case? Kind of, to help us say, well, it says right here they're going to keep them free from neglect. We'll only admit residents whose needs can be met within its licensure category. That came into place with the woman who got hit by the car. And then the secure environment staffing. So the functional evaluation is what they do for the individual residents to see what they can do on their own and what kind of assistance they need. In her functional evaluation, it said she used a walker. Her walker was not outside when she was found laying on the ground. She has total confusion. She wanders daily, and her security score was a 5. And it specifically said, wanders within a secured area but can be redirected to return, would be at risk to jeopardize health or safety outside the secured area. So this woman needs a lot of oversight. Yes? I hear
Right
my
here.
name coming from the...
For people who don't know, on the security score, what's the range? What does a 5 mean?
That's an excellent question. So every facility has a different functional assessment or a functional evaluation, but it has a scale there. So this particular evaluation had a 1 through 5. 5 was the highest. And it will tell you kind of what the range is and what they mean on these assessments, but they differ between facilities for sure. Anything else? Okay. So this was her care plan. And again, it's super small. So the stuff that I circled under behavior status options, it said she was confused, disoriented, and wanders. The other activities, she loves going out in the back. Staff needs to keep an eye on her and bring her in if it's too hot or too cold. She's outside, it's 28 degrees, right? Note on the bottom says, resident has been picking little things up from the floor and eating it. Staff needs to redirect her not to, like leaves and sticks. So let me tell you a little bit more about this woman. She grew up in very rural Mexico. They had no indoor plumbing. We're talking super rural. So she, in her dementia journey, was back in Mexico. And she was used to using the restroom out in the backyard. And they were trying to discourage that because, that's not really a happy thing to do in the Denver metro area. She also would take sticks and leaves and put them into her underwear, and she kept having infections, and she would put rocks in her pockets and kind of collect them. And they were trying to redirect her, but because of all of that, she was wearing this jumper. It's a t-shirt sewn to sweatpants, basically, that is really difficult to get in and out of. That's what she was wearing the morning that she was found. So the next step for me in this investigation was to figure out how long she had been out there. And shockingly, their surveillance system wasn't working. So I didn't have that. There was one staff member on duty that night. She had signed off on all the 15-minute checks. So clearly they had to happen, right? Nobody lies. What? So I started to look at science, and I found a ton of articles that shows the cooling rate of human beings at different temperatures when they're dead. There were hardly any for living victims. So I found one in Forensic Science International, and it was the forensic relevance of hypothermia in living persons. It was a literature and retrospective study. Now, they studied cooling rates, and it wasn't a huge study. It was a very small study. So what I wound up doing was just taking everybody. I found someone who was kind of close to her weight and kind of close to the temperature, and I was able to hone it in on that. But instead I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna take everybody. What was the average cooling rate? And I found that throughout the study, all the cooling rates showed between a 1.62 and a 5.45 degree Fahrenheit per hour cooling rate. Per hour. And that's for people who weighed a lot more than her and less than her. So anybody remember what her body temperature was? 84. It's 14 degrees. How long was she outside? A hell of a lot longer than 15 minutes. Right? So that's kind of how I was going with that investigation. So this was the internal investigation. And this is where we started to look just beyond that caregiver that I believe falsified that information. It says the back alarm was turned off in the red box. We'll reinforce to make sure employees are checking it's on. We do have a resident that keeps turning it off. So I start interviewing people and looking at this documentation, and yeah, the resident totally kept turning it off because it was next to his door and it was loud as anything. And one of the regulations shows that that door has to remain unlocked. They are required to have a secure outdoor area for people so they have the right to go outside and get some fresh air. But this gentleman was not happy with this alarm, and it was loud. It was really loud. This is what the alarm looked like. Is this tough for anybody, even with dementia, to figure out how the heck to turn it off? It says off right there. So my argument to the facility was, if you're depending on this alarm to help meet that protective oversight, help give you protective oversight over your residents so you know who's coming in and out, you better hardwire it in. Because they had months and months and months of documentation with this gentleman turning off this alarm. And it was over 6 months that they had issues with this alarm. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so this case we're going to talk about, I know it's not an elder case, but this case is close to my heart, and it's a really good example of how our investigative process goes. So Booty was a 31-year-old, nonverbal, developmentally disabled male resident. He had a G-tube because he would aspirate if he drank anything. He kept aspirating. So he was NPO, he had nothing by mouth, not his meds, not liquids, not food. He hated his G-tube. So he would constantly pull his G-tube out, which required ER visits to have it reinserted. So he wore a cummerbund to protect that G-tube, but it didn't stop him. It just delayed him a little bit. It made it a little harder. He also had a pretty severe seizure disorder, and he was having tonic-clonic seizures, drop to the floor, you know, true seizure, like true grand mal seizures. There were several documented injuries from those seizures. When he died, he actually had a laceration with stitches over his head from a seizure about 3 days prior. He also had aggressive tendencies. When he didn't like anything, he would use his behavior to communicate that. And sometimes his behavior was a little more aggressive than people like, and he would hit and punch and kick. So for all of those reasons, they had him on a line of sight protocol. They said, whenever Booty is awake, he will be in your line of sight. He used to be a one-on-one, but then they moved him to a different house, and his behavior improved. So they said, you know what, you still need to watch him. He needs to be line of sight, but you don't have to be right next to him. He started to listen when they said, Booty, don't touch that. Don't touch your G-tube. Don't pull it. And he started to listen. So they lessened it a little bit. But he was line of sight protocol. The night or the morning that he died, he indicated that he wanted to take a bath. According to the caregivers who were on staff, this occurred at 3:30 a.m. There's no argument that Booty was in the bathroom alone. He was found at 3:40 in the tub with his face underwater. They pulled him out, tried CPR. They were unsuccessful. This is the police report from that morning. Says Victoria, who's one of the caregivers, said Booty does not require constant supervision for baths, but did need to be checked on every 15 minutes per their protocol. What's this? This is a lie. And I know it's shocking that people would lie to police, but she lied. And the police didn't look any further. They wrote this off as an accidental death. The coroner's office wrote it off as an accidental death. This happened in 2014. The only person who didn't write this off as an accidental death was our nurse. Our nurse found the occurrence report, pulled it, gave it to administration. Our old administration was not very pro abuse and neglect cases, and they said, nope, locals have looked at it, we're not opening a case. And Millie McParlane, my nurse, sat on this case for 2 years. And when I came in 2016, she gave it to me. She said, what do you think of this case? I said, holy crap, this is a great case. Let's do it. And then my boss, Bob Booth, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because he had a meeting, he came in and said, absolutely, we're doing this case. And we were able to investigate this case. But I started investigating this case 2 years after it happened. That's really hard to do because all the evidence is gone. So I filed this case. You have a 3-year statute of limitation on most cases, most felony cases. I filed this case a week before the statute of limitations ran. So I started looking at all the stuff that I looked at in the last case, the client file, the training files, all of that. And he had a behavior program that was either 16 or 19 pages long. And in his behavior program, it's clear, line of sight protocol. In his file, I found human rights, that he had to have a human rights hearing because of violation of privacy. He had no privacy because he was line of sight protocol. This was not a secret. It details in this why, and it's constantly amended, which is why you see the date under there. But I mean, it says, Booty requires direct line of sight supervision whenever he is awake. When he's asleep, he required 15-minute checks. And that's, I think, where the 15-minute thing came in. And it even goes further saying that if he's asleep, you need to visually check his G-tube and make sure it's still in place. And if he's awake in bed, get him up so he doesn't mess with his G-tube. These are the cues and clues. And no offense, but I see a lot of older people like me. Those of us over 30 understand what Cliff Notes are. Under 30, you have the internet. You never have to read a book again. Those of us who are older, they were these yellow books with black stripes. And if you got assigned a horrendously long novel and you procrastinated like I did, you could grab the Cliff Notes and read it in a night and say, well, these are the major points and ideas behind this book. And they had some great insights that got me through English Lit. Cues and clues are the Cliff Notes of that 18-page behavior program. So these are the highlights. These are the stuff that you have to know to pass the test or to provide care. So it says, and the reason they do this is because if there is floating staff or if there is a change in their behavior program, they highlight it on here so that when staff comes in, they aren't expected to read an 18-page behavior program every night because these are very fluid documents. So they have a 3-page cues and clues that's bulleted out for them. So Booty has a seizure disorder, refer to seizure protocol. So my daughter has a seizure disorder. And when she was diagnosed, the very first thing her neurologist said was, you have to start taking seizure precautions. And I said, okay, well, what are seizure precautions? And he said, the number one seizure precaution is never, ever, ever leave her alone in water. Never be out of arm's reach in a pool. And never leave her in a tub unattended. Because if she has a seizure, she will drown. Number one, and that is across the board. I mean, anyone with any sort of medical training will know that. and especially an LPT, licensed psychiatric technician who deals with people with seizure disorders, absolutely knows seizure protocols. He requires line of sight supervision when awake. This is getting redundant, right? Restrictive procedures, line of sight protocol. This is the second page of his Q's and clues. If you look at the bottom, this actually could have become a problem for us, but luckily it didn't. It says he is able to independently toilet. He may lock a bathroom door behind him for privacy. And I interviewed his psychiatrist and said, why did you put this in here? Everything, it seems to be the opposite of what you're saying throughout the entire document. And she said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I wrote that. I meant in a public restroom. I said, well, be a little more specific next time. Luckily, this did not come up, but that could have really become a defense. And then it says he prefers baths, and due to seizure disorder, this is safest because of his tonic-clonic seizures. If he's line of sight protocol, so he shouldn't be alone in the bath. But if he has a seizure in the shower, he's going down and going to crack his head open on tile. If a bath is drawn for him and he's provided with the necessary materials, blah, 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 he should have close visual supervision during bathing for prevention of injury should he have a seizure. They were required to read these at the beginning of every shift. Both caregivers should have read this document at the beginning of every shift. So I kind of skipped over the fact that I look at care notes and nurses' notes whenever I get a case. And in their care notes that evening at 8 p.m., it says that there's a note from the LPT that she tried to give him his meds and he tried to pull his G-tube out. And so there was a struggle trying to get him away from his G-tube, and she spilled his meds. And so he only got about a quarter of his meds that night. So they called the doctor and were told to monitor for adverse effects. To me, that means watch him closer. Doesn't mean, are you seeing where I'm getting the standard of care here? Are we seeing the gross deviation? Is there any question that this is a gross deviation at this point? Okay. So I mentioned CDPHE helped us with the case because the sheriff's office went out and called this an accidental death. They did take pictures, as we do in any DOA case. But CDPHE noticed this sign on the bathroom door, and it says, to all staff, per psych, booty is not to be left unattended in the restroom for any reasons. Questions, call Randy. So when I looked at the sheriff's office photos, you can see this sign on the bathroom door. You can see it. There's a strip of paper, and you can see that it's 3 lines long. You can't zoom in close enough to actually see the writing because, trust me, I tried. I'm like there with a microscope, and it's all pixely. But you can tell that it's this sign. CDPHE documented that that's where they found this sign. If cops had just opened their eyes, they would have seen it, but they didn't. They saw a disabled guy who drowned in the bathtub, and it was a tragedy, but accidental. So, seizure recording sheets. There were hundreds of documented seizures along with the signatures of staff. And it kind of describes what the seizure was. The highlighted one there, now this is just one page out of, there were, I don't even know how many pages, maybe 15. Those highlights on just one page were the suspect in this case, Vicki Pletting. And she says, stiff, convulsions. She's documenting it. So here's Vicki. She was a licensed psychiatric technician, which is the equivalent of, they have more training than CNAs, but it's in this psychiatric world, in the IDD world. But it's a licensed position. She wasn't new. She had worked for the facility for, 6 years? She had worked with Booty the entire time he was at the facility. I mentioned that he started at one house and had a lot of aggressive tendencies, and then they moved him to a different house and his behavior got better. So they moved him from a male house to a female house because the floors were being done and they had to get all the males out of that one house. So they placed him in like a separate wing of the female house, just temporarily. And Booty loved the ladies, man. He would flirt with them, and his behavior improved tenfold when he went to the female's house because he didn't have that aggression with the other males. So they said, you know what, this could work as long as we keep him on the other side of the house. And at that time, they moved Vicki from his old house to his new house because she was the one most familiar with him. He loved Vicky. He would listen to Vicky better than any other caregiver. So in her past, she had written disciplinary action, but this was all really early in her career. In the last 2 years that she was there, she had no disciplinary action. However, 2 weeks prior to his death, there was an email that was going around. She wrote up that, hey, Booty came in, she wrote an incident report, and it was that Booty came in from the backyard holding his G-tube. And Allison, kind of the head of that house, said, well, why wasn't anybody in the backyard with him? Like, what do you mean he came in holding his G-tube? He's line of sight. And so there were all these emails going back and forth. Hey, remind Vicky that he's line of sight. Make sure Vicky's familiar with his line of sight protocol. So I had these emails from 2 weeks prior. And that's that last thing. Okay, so.
It's a little concerning that she has to be reminded of the line of sight when she's his most favored caregiver.
Yes, it is.
And I'm wondering, in this particular case, is there a guardian involved? I mean, who is in this person's life?
Unfortunately, not a lot of people. So he had family. His history, he was from Laos. Don't quote me on that. His family immigrated here when he was younger. Only his brother spoke English. So his brother was our main family contact. They lived in an apartment in Aurora, and Booty kept assaulting family members. Booty was short, but he was strong, and he was kind of a bigger guy. And there were times that he eloped and were running down the street. The family could not take care of him. And when we met with the family, his brother would visit him occasionally, every other month maybe, every third month, but nobody was really in his life. However, this is all public record. This happened at Wheat Ridge Regional Center. And when I did my investigation at Wheat Ridge Regional Center, I was incredibly impressed. They had very little turnover, which we all know is super rare in this field. They handled the internal investigation, which we're about to talk about, very well. They loved him. I'm investigating this 2.5 years after it happened, and every single person from Wheat Ridge Regional that I interviewed cried when they talked about Booty's death. They loved him. And we're going to get into kind of it's tragic, and it was a mistake, but at the same time, it's negligent.
So was he a ward of the state then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so we talked about the internal investigations. And the guy who did this was a guy named Doug Severinsen. And he used to be a cop, and he did a fantastic job on this internal investigation. And he wrote out questions, those are the ones on the left, and her responses were the ones on the right. So, do you know he has a seizure disorder? Yes, I know he has seizures. I've had to give him Diastat. Does anybody know what Diastat is? Did somebody say yes? Raise your hand if you know what Diastat is. Okay, yes?
It's a medication that's used rectally to control seizures.
She said it's a medication used rectally to control seizures. Very good. So Diastat is given if it's an emergency drug. So if someone's in seizure for quite a long time and they are not coming out of it, it's a suppository. So if you have to insert a suppository into someone who is in the middle of a tonic-clonic seizure, you're going to remember they have a seizure disorder. Third question, have you ever left him in the bath before? She wrote, I have not, crossed out not, and then my eyes crossed out too, left him alone in the bathtub. He started to take baths on our shift, blah, blah, blah. I actually came back to that during my interrogation with her because that stood out to me so much. She absolutely had left him in the bathtub before. And that's kind of one of those little cop things. And this is just, Doug did such a good job on this. So during my interrogation with Vicky, she had changed her story so many times. So Wheat Ridge Regional is a state-run facility. And so she's a state employee. Do we have any state employees in here? Okay, so when, as a classified state employee, they want to demote or fire us, what do they need to do? Do you know?
Disciplinary action,
Okay, so corrective action, but in a case of something like this, you have the right to an administrative hearing. They can't just fire you if you're a classified employee in the state, which I have some own personal arguments with mediocrity versus outstanding work, but in order to get fired, you are allowed to have a 610 hearing. And the fun thing about 610 hearings are they're recorded, and they're kept for I don't know how many years, but I still had her 610 hearing. She told 3 different stories in the 610 hearing. She told like 2 or 3 other stories between CDPHE, the internal investigation, and the law enforcement investigation, where she said, oh, he's 15-minute checks. Basically, the other caregiver who I charged, and eventually the charges were dropped, much to my disappointment, she told her, she was a floater. She had worked with Booty 8 different occasions. I pulled the schedules. I wanted to see how many times she had worked with Booty. How many times was she supposed to read that he was line of sight protocol? Now, most of these were overnight shifts that she was working. That was kind of her argument. When Booty went into the bathroom that night, the other caregiver said, is he supposed to be in the bathroom alone? And Vicki said, yes, he's 15-minute checks. My argument was, had she done her job and read the behavior program or read those cues and clues, she would have known he wasn't. And then she asked Vicki again, are you sure he's supposed to be in the bathroom alone? There's like a freaking sign there that says he's not supposed to be, but you know, who am I? And Vicki said 3 times, he's 15-minute checks. This other lady's argument was, well, Vicki was senior to me. I'm just following orders that he's allowed to be in the bathroom alone. And the charges were dismissed. I have issue with that. I really wanted to take it to trial. I'm like, yeah, let's take it. And I lost that fight, but I tried. So when I interrogated Vicki, she had told so many freaking stories. And so I was just trying to get to the truth at that point. And she admitted she knew he had a line of sight protocol. And she admitted that she knew he was in the bathtub. And she admitted all of this stuff. And I said, you know what, Vicki, I know all this. This is all I have the case file. I said, this is all here. What I don't know is why. Why did you tell her he was 15-minute checks? Why did you do this? And she said, because we had so much to do and he'd always been okay. Oh, I'm sorry. She said, because we had so much to do. I said, so you were cooking and where was the other lady? She said she was in the laundry room. Suddenly she remembered where she was because she knew. She just didn't remember how many stories she had told us, but she knew what the truth was. It's a traumatic incident. You remember traumatic incidents. So then I said, she said, and he'd always been okay. And I said, okay, he'd always been okay in the bathtub when you've left him in there before. I said, how many times have you left him in that bathtub before? And she said, I don't know, 8 or 9. So because of that, I charged her with manslaughter. I went right over criminally negligent homicide because it wasn't a gross, well, it was, we charged actually both. Beyond the gross deviation from the standard of care a reasonable person would take, absolutely it was, but it was also a reckless disregard that a circumstance exists. And that's what manslaughter is. Unfortunately, there's no enhancer for manslaughter. So remember, we went back to those, we talked about the enhancers under 6.5103 that raises it a level. Well, we don't have, manslaughter's not in there. So so manslaughter is an F4 or class 4 felony. Well, so is criminally negligent homicide against an at-risk. But I charged both because I felt it was both. It was absolutely reckless what she did, and he died as a result of it. So she pled to criminally negligent homicide, so she caught the felony. And we have a lot of work to do with our judicial system. Well, not only the judicial system. We have a lot of work to do in the entire criminal justice system when it comes to crimes against at-risk adults and elders. They do not take these crimes seriously. Anybody want to gander what Vicki was sentenced to after she pled to a class 5 felony, criminally negligent homicide? Okay, raise your hand so I can call on people. Yeah. She did not get a deferred sentence. We were not going to give her a deferred sentence. She caught the felony. 2 years what? 2 years jail? 2 years Department of Corrections. No. 2 years probation. But she can't work with disabled people anymore. Okay. 2 years probation. I have another case that's similar to the one with the lady outside. It's the same kind of circumstances, but that lady passed away. We still have a couple. We're slated for trial with one of the defendants. One pled in November to, we charged her with criminally negligent homicide of an at-risk. The woman was left outside in the sun for 3 hours when she was supposed to be checked on every 15 minutes. She died. The cause of death was probable heat stress. That's what the coroner wrote. He said during or the pathologist, he said during my interview with him, if it weren't for this, she would not have died that day. Guess what she was sentenced to? 2 years probation. Yes, ma'am.
Ally, so when you went back 2 years post-death and you're interviewing in your investigation, is Vicki still at the same facility? She's moved on?
No. So, well, yes, she's moved on. So I talked about how great Wheat Ridge Regional was through all of this. They absolutely substantiated the neglect and fired both of them immediately. So it was not, she wasn't still there.
But was she a caregiver somewhere
Oh,
else?
yes. Yeah. She was caregiving. She wasn't working for a facility. She was doing personal caregiving up till the sentencing.
So we were just talking now that with the new CAPS law that people should know in this room, that will change that, hopefully, that she will not be
Yes and no.
reemployed. Yeah,
Because she hadn't been charged yet.
hadn't been substantiated at that point.
It was substantiated through the internal investigation, and I can't remember if CDPHE substantiated. I think they did.
Okay.
So she may have been, but she was working privately for some lady down the street, so they never would have known. And at the sentencing, one of the conditions of probation was you will not work for anyone who's disabled or an at-risk adult. And she was like, well, I'm supposed to work today. He's like, then you better find somebody else to take care of her.
She has very limited awareness,
Yeah,
to say the
yeah.
least.
Yes, ma'am.
How many hours of interviewing did Vicki have for her to admit that she had left him alone in the bathtub?
I'm sorry, I believe your question was how many hours of interrogation or interviewing did I do with her?
Yeah, or like in total for her to finally say, I left him alone in the tub.
I don't know about how many hours the other people spent with her, but when I got the case, I only interviewed her once. And my interview/interrogation was about an hour and maybe an hour and a half, probably closer to hour 15. And, you know, for about the first 45 minutes, she spun a tale. And you always start with building rapport and going with her history and, hey, tell me, how many years have you been a caregiver? And kind of given that background. So I have it from her lips. Yes, I've been a caregiver I have 25 years of experience or whatever it's going to be. And then you kind of get into, you start kind of peeling away layers. And so tell me about that night. And she kept changing her story and kept changing her story. And I was like, Vicki, the issue I have is back when Doug interviewed you, this is what you said. Now you're saying this. Why are you changing your story? You know, and then you pull another interview and say, but in your 610 hearing, you said this. But in this, and she started to say, but I don't remember. I said, no, you don't remember because you're lying. You don't remember the stories you've told. You and I both know that you remember what happened that night. And so you start peeling away and kind of do that. And then, funny story, kind of off subject, I had a mentor back in the 90s. He was a detective with Arvada PD, and his name was Chuck Marshall. And his was the first interview and interrogation class I ever attended. And he had this thing called the rope of truth. And he was like, once you get them to a certain point, you throw them the rope of truth. And you're drowning. The only thing that's going to save you is this rope of truth. And so I've modified that a little to my own style. But every time I go into the, you know, my kind of approach is, you know, do you have kids? Yes, I have kids. Or no, I don't have kids. Okay, well, when you were a kid, or I have kids, I talk about my kids. If my son breaks a lamp and he comes to me and he says, Mom, I screwed up. I was playing ball in the house. I messed up. I broke the lamp. I'm really sorry. I go easier on him than if I find a broken lamp and he lies to me and he says, no, I didn't do it. And then I pull the video recording and I see that because we have like a video system in our house right now. It's so fun. And then I can say, no, you broke the lamp, dude. And then he's in more trouble. So I tell the story during my interrogation, say the courts are the same way. If you take responsibility and clearly you're remorseful, you feel bad about this, you didn't mean for this to happen, but you need to take responsibility, and they go for it, and they tell us, and it's not a lie. I mean, because if you do say, ultimately they came clean, they admitted it, she was crying, she felt remorseful, it goes a long way in those plea agreements and whatnot. And so that's usually how I get the truth out. And that's what I used with her. And she was like, yeah, I knew he was in the tub. Because some of the stories, she didn't know he was in the tub. Some of the stories, he slammed the door. We went so far as to talk to the person who did his functional assessment to figure out, would Booty have been able to turn on the water and draw his own bath? Because I think that he could absolutely turn it on. I think that he could probably plug the tub, move that lever, but I don't know that he would have turned it off. And he was found in about 8 inches of water. It was not even close to the top. My daughter has special needs. My daughter absolutely could turn on the tub and probably find a good temperature for herself, but she would overflow that thing. Like, I would have water going down the stairs if my daughter tried to run her own bath. And that was kind of what we came to with Booty. We think someone drew that bath. Never got a straight answer on who drew that bath. I think it was her coworker, frankly. But her coworker wouldn't talk to me. She opted not to be interviewed. So, and I can't force anybody to talk to me in a criminal investigation. So I kind of lost my train. I got on a spiel there and kind of lost my train of thought. But that's kind of how we got her to confess. And it didn't take, I've had worse, like I've had harder interrogations to do. But I used the same. Yeah, my sex assault this week, I used the same type thing with my suspect yesterday. It was not funny in a ha-ha kind of way, but he brought up the showers. He's sitting there and he said, I said, tell me about your experience working here. And he said, well, I don't think it's right that males should have to shower women. And as soon as he said the word shower, his hand started to shake. And every time he said the word shower, his hand started to shake. And I'm sitting there like, holy crap, he did this. Like, he's showing me every sign that he did this. And so I did the whole lamp thing and all that. And then I did the DNA thing that I talked to you about. And then finally he said, I'm scared. Right? As soon as they say, I'm scared, you know you're about to get a confession. And so it's like, I know you're scared. Let me help me help you, let me help you through this and blah, blah, blah. And then he said, I have urges. And I was like, oh, crap. Okay, we're doing this. And then he tried to say he was a sex addict, but whatever. So that's kind of how we do our interrogations. So now if anybody's ever interrogated, grab onto that rope of truth. Okay, so we talked about the training records. Again, the time cards and schedules. I wanted to find out how many times this floater had worked with him. They had to sign off that they knew the line of sight protocol. We had those signatures for Vicky, but we did not have the signatures for the other person, which was part of the reason that they wanted to drop the charges, or did. Those 610 hearings that I already talked about, those internal investigations are gold. And then any ER notes. With him, we had prior falls from the seizures. We had G-tube pulls. There were so many ER visits. And then I give a whole class on interviewing people with disabilities. And my number one problem with the local reports that I'm seeing right now is they don't take the time to interview, well, in this case, obviously Booty's dead, but their victim or their witnesses. I mentioned my daughter has special needs. She's considered nonverbal. She is the bossiest, loudest, nonverbal child that you will ever meet. She will tell you to sit there on the couch, and you will sit there. She bosses her brother around. My son's 11, she's 9. She tells him what to do. She bosses the dog around, right? Unless someone is in a coma, they are able to communicate, whether they can blink, whether they gesture. I had a case with a severely autistic gentleman who had burns, second-degree burns, across his backside, thighs, and scrotum from a water burn. And the local agency didn't even photograph his injuries. They never tried to talk to him. So this was one of my earlier cases, and I get his file and I'm reading through it. I'm like, okay, well, he's nonverbal and he knows some sign. I know some sign. My daughter's nonverbal. So I go out to interview this guy like I'm the nonverbal whisperer, right? Well, I got knocked off my pedestal pretty quickly because he's severely autistic. However, when I went in, his name was Chris. When I went in, I said, wow, that TV is really loud, because there was a TV on. And he immediately grabbed the remote, pointed to how to turn it down, and turned it down. What does that show me? He has great receptive communication skills. He understands what I'm saying. And then there was a toy that caught my attention because it had a little eye. And at first I thought it was a nanny cam. And I was like, what the heck? So I picked it up, and it was a motion-activated toy, and then somebody had pulled the batteries out. So I popped the batteries back in. It was a really loud and obnoxious toy that like rolled around every time somebody walked by it. He was really excited. I understood why the caregivers had popped the batteries, but he got all excited and started clapping and jumping up and down. He's communicating with me, right? And I wanted to take photos of his scarring because he was in Swedish for 2 months getting skin grafts. And so I wanted to take pictures. So we go into his room with his caregiver, and she begins to undress him. And as any 23-year-old man would, he was uncomfortable being undressed with me in the room. Duh. He started grunting and making fists. He is communicating, right? Even though he can't tell me this is who burned me and this is how it happened. When he was at the hospital, they thought he had been sexually assaulted because he wouldn't go into the bathroom. Well, what do hospital bathrooms have plain as day? A shower. He's communicating. We tried to do a forensic interview with him, doing this nonverbal interviewing technique that a guy named Scott Modell established, which is fantastic. And I encourage everybody, if you have the opportunity if you have to interview people in your job and have the opportunity to see Scott Modell, go. He's amazing. But we tried to interview him. Chris didn't have the cognitive ability to consistently answer the questions. However, during the interview, he signed EAT, grabbed his caregiver, and this is recorded, grabbed his caregiver, pulled her over to the pantry and pointed to the fruit snacks. Is there any question that he was hungry and wanted fruit snacks? No. So he can communicate. And so all of the documentation that they did, that he's walking like a duck, that he's grimacing, that he was resisting sitting down for 36 hours before they got him medical care, that's him communicating he's in pain, right? And I can base a case off that they delayed medical care. So that's my spiel on interviewing witnesses and victims. Sorry, I have a lot of soapboxes I jump on. Okay, so in summary, we're here as a resource. We're here for a resource for law enforcement, for APS, for citizens that have questions. That's a huge part of my job, and please contact me if you have any questions. If I don't know the answer, I'm probably gonna send you to my administrative assistant, Stephanie Lim, who will find the answer for you. Pay attention to those signs and symptoms of fraud, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. If you need to get through that subjectiveness of our criminal negligence statute, go to that CDPHE. And even if you just have like an APS case, or if you have a question about what's going on in a facility, go to that CDPHE. It is so detailed, down to documenting fluid intake. I mean, they get very, very specific. And then just keep in mind the unique type of evidence that we see in facility investigations. Questions? Yes, Chuck. You're loud. You can yell.
Well, back first to my first one about the staffing and the pay.
Okay, so, thank you. What we would need to do is determine that it's inadequate staffing. Pay, we have no control over. If they take the job, then they've agreed to the pay. If they've taken that job, they've agreed to do their job duties, plain and simple. However, staffing, what we need to show is a deviation from that standard of care, that they are so understaffed that there is no way that their staff can meet that protective oversight and the adequate care that the protective or that the regulations require. It's super subjective, it's super hard. We've done it. If you have a staffing issue, however, then you're looking at the facility. not the individual caregivers. So then you have to figure out, well, who's responsible for the staffing? Is it the administrator? Is it the owner? Is it the company? And that's why, frankly, the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit exists and why this is one of our jobs. I have a huge investigation involving a corporation right now that operates 24 facilities in the state, and we are looking at them for understaffing. Part of what we're doing with that is looking at, hey, they have 24 facilities, but they have over 500 positions posted online. I think they're understaffed. Then we start also interviewing staff members. How many staff members do you have on shift? And it's a huge pain in the butt, but we can do it. And it comes down to that, okay, are you meeting those minimum requirements of the regulations and providing adequate care for these people? Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Kind of. There's no easy answer for it, unfortunately. They're horrendously hard cases, and you have to have a prosecutor who is willing to take a risk.
Thank
Which
you.
those are hard to come by, I know. But
Yeah, on another note, you mentioned getting the survey results from CDPHE. They fail to respond even to court orders for production of records and cite some statute that says they don't have to. How do you get around that?
Well, they've never told me no. Call me on that and let me look at that statute, because I'm not sure what they're basing that on. I need to look a little bit closer. If you feel that you're the first person who's ever brought up that they've been uncooperative. If you feel that you absolutely need it, call me and we can open an assist, and I can, if it fits, or we can try to do a workaround on that. But call me later and tell me what statute, and we can kind of dig into that a little bit, and I can get the big people involved to try to, because if you guys don't know the Attorney General's office, we have 10 different divisions. One is or state services, and they're the legal representation for every state agency. So they're on a different floor than us. We're criminal justice. We're the ones who go after bad guys and put them in jail. So it's interesting because very often we're calling people in our office to say, hey, we're not getting records from, not Wheat Ridge Regional, but like Pueblo, let's say. We're not getting these records that we've requested, that we've demanded. The fun thing about, sorry, I'm going off on a little spiel. The fun thing about the Medicaid Control Unit is everybody who accepts Medicaid, by being part of the program, they've already agreed to give us any records on demand. So while you guys need probable cause to do a court order for production of records, I can, for one person, if you have evidence against one, but you think it's a facility-wide issue, I can go in and say, hey, I need all your client files. And they have to give it to me. If they don't, we turn off Medicaid funding, which essentially shuts them down on most facilities. And we've done it. We had a dental office that would not give us records. And so we called HCPF, and they turned off their funding that day. It's a good tool to have in our pocket. Any other questions, Chuck? Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm Bob Epstein. I chair the Colorado Senior Lobby, and going back to the law, the statute for mandatory reporting.
Yes, sir.
I'm part of the lobby team that got that thing through.
Yeah. No,
Charles
it's a good
Carter.
statute.
Yeah. I didn't work on it for 15 years. Charles Carter did, and lobbied for it personally, and I was with that team. We got it through. Now, my question is, you now have a new administration, a new attorney general, et cetera. Do you envision any changes in policy or recommended statutes or legislation to further define or strengthen the mandatory reporting and other areas? Because we're the ones who do that.
Right.
So just so we will gladly work with you and
Awesome.
And get that stuff through.
Yeah, and if you want, my contact information is on the next page. So if you want, and I can give you a card, if you want to send me your information, I can absolutely keep that in mind. I am not one of those big people who makes legislative suggestions even. I'm really low on the totem pole. However, what I can tell you is I know in Phil Weiser's campaign, and what we met with him last week, we're very excited. We've had some internal discord in the AG's office, especially in our division, and we're really excited that Phil's there. We have a new deputy of our division named Janet Drake. She's amazing. I've known Janet since 2005. We're really excited at the changes that are coming. The entire office is rejuvenated, and we think it's going to be a good term. He told us that he is very concerned about elder abuse. That's one thing that he really wants to strengthen. Of course, the opioid crisis, he wants us to take that as a mission. He also mentioned environmental crimes. As for specific legislation, I can't speak to that, but I can definitely, Bob, my boss, my big boss, he is more involved in that stuff. I just have a lot of cases and do trainings. But yeah, if you want to send me your information, I'll give you my card. I can get your information to Bob. Okay. Other questions? Yes. Everybody's pointing to somebody, but I don't know who they're pointing to.
Oh, okay, I thought Leah had somebody. So we work with a program that's funded through the surcharge collected against crimes against older adults and people with vulnerable individuals. Our funding is being pretty flat. What's the best strategy for making sure the courts are imposing those fines when they have those convictions? And do you see the courts doing that as a rule?
I know in our cases they have been, but we've been asking for it. I think, and this is just totally off the cuff right now because this is not something that I would really typically deal with. I think the best strategy is to get with the DA's offices and be like, hey, y'all need to make sure you're asking for the surcharge because that's who has to do it. They have to say, you know, let's be honest, most crimes are pled, right? And as part of those plea agreements, they detail out, hey, they're subject to this surcharge and this surcharge, and that's all listed out on plea agreements. So that's who I would start with, is start reaching out to your elder abuse. Either victim advocates can start that process within the DA's offices or the DA or prosecutors themselves. That's where I would start if I had an issue. But we do it. What other questions do we have? Okay, well, thank you all so much for all of your attention and your input with me. And here's my contact information and my boss's contact information. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. Email's faster than calling because I'm not in my office very often, but you can leave me a message. Okay, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
On behalf of CRAP Alley, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation.